There are actual pictographs in Oregon of a Bigfoot that are dated to, furthest dating was like 3,000 years old. So in some areas, like native tribes will consider them friendly. And they live in clans and they interact with them a little bit. While in others, like the Bigfoot's like dragging their women away and eating their kids.
I mean, all of these, almost as a thread throughout all of these cultures, they all claim that this is a supernatural being that lives between, that basically lives half in the realm of rebirth. But no, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years here, maybe even thousands of years where people have been seeing this. Perhaps the most well-recorded cryptid ever is Bigfoot's cousin, the Yeti. So the Metaphysical Podcast had to dive into the history you never knew was real. What are the different classifications of Yetis? What did American explorers find when they went looking for it in the 1950s? Are all the Yeti relics that exist today just debunked hoaxes, or is there evidence the Yeti left behind?
Hear remote viewing data from me, John Vivanco, on the Abominable Snowman himself that will blow your mind. Hear investigative research from Rob Counts on the history of the Yeti, and tune in for a show that's out of this world. Are you listening to the Metaphysical Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or elsewhere? Leave us that 5-star rating and review. It really helps us reach more people. And remember, you've got to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Ganjing World, Twitter, and Facebook.
Hey, John, how you doing?
Hey, good.
Good. Today's subject is one that I've been waiting for a long time. We're going to be talking about the most recorded cryptid in the history of our planet, I think. Like, we've got an ancient history that has followed this thing called the Yeti. And yeah, we're going to be getting into that. And I think, John, you were just, before the show just started, you were kind of just telling me a few things about how I think a lot of people commonly think that the ideas around the Yeti started. What happened?
Yeah, I wanted to find out, because native cultures, Native American in the United States to like Eastern cultures where the Yeti is, they have their creation myths about, everything in the world. And so I was doing searches around, what are the creation myths from native cultures on Bigfoot and the Yeti. And literally, like, every article that would show up coming from CNN, BBC, all of these like mainstream places saying that the modern, or the myth of Bigfoot, for instance, began with the Patterson-Gimlin film. And
I've never heard of this thing. What is the
Patterson-Gimlin film? Is that film? I don't remember the year. It must have been 70s or 60s of a person taking, it's like a Super 8 camera, using a Super 8 camera of a Bigfoot running across. It's that famous film. Bigfoot running across a rocky area in front of a stream in the Pacific Northwest. So media claims that this was the beginning of the Bigfoot myth, right?
That super famous video is called the Gimlin.
Yeah.
Oh, because we've showed this on the show. I think I've just not remembered the name of this.
Yeah, the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Got it.
Right. And so I was looking specifically for what are the creation myths surrounding both the Yeti and the Bigfoot, and mainstream doesn't even bring any of that stuff up. You can't find that stuff unless you dig really, really deep. Even then, it's very difficult because native cultures across the world have been experiencing this creature for a lot longer than 19 whatevers. So I found that interesting, and they also claim that scientists have figured out what the Yeti is.
Which is
And
what?
yeah. I mean, it's like it's unequivocal in these articles that it's just a bear.
That's
It's
frustrating.
just a
I mean,
bear, man.
yeah, it's again, oh, the ancient people were all just stupid and they had
Right?
no
Yeah,
way.
they don't know
We're
what they're
talking
doing.
we're talking about people that were outside a lot
Right?
more than us.
People that were outside. I know, man.
Like we're
It's
all
like
inside researching crap from an armchair now, and we're then like, oh, it was just a bear, and ancient people were stupid. They're
right,
outside all the time. They don't have TVs or computers. All they do is look at bears all the time, and they can't
right.
tell something that looks strange, you know,
Yeah,
apart from a bear.
exactly. It's so fascinating. Just the engineering that goes on through these mediums is unbelievable. Unbelievable to me. Like really, like you pull up native myths, native stories of any land, and you're gonna find leads into what's truthful, not not stuff that mainstream is putting out.
We,
Unbelievable stuff.
yeah, and
And they
you know,
neglect that. 100% neglect that. I
I
just
think
couldn't believe that they were saying the myth of Bigfoot began with that film. I just couldn't believe they said that because native peoples have had stories of that since forever.
yeah, and we're again, it's like we're that film is a film that was taken where somewhere in the United States. I can't even remember where. The
I
Patterson
think in
Gym,
Oregon.
Oregon. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just a few decades ago, several
Right.
decades ago.
Right. You know,
Eh,
there are actual pictographs in
from
Oregon.
California, actually.
Okay,
North
California, right.
Yeah.
There are actual pictographs in Oregon of a Bigfoot that are dated to furthest dating was like 3,000 years old.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, okay, so, um, now what John is talking about here and why that's so frustrating is because we're talking about cultures in Nepal and Tibet that have we're talking about thousands of years of history here with this strange bear man creature. Some of them would call him a translation of a bear man or spirit of the glaciers or a wild man of the forest, wild man of the Himalayas, snowman, mountain savage, cattle bear, bear man. Yeah, bear man though. So it's like they're delineating the difference between a bear and this creature because it's standing on two legs in a lot of these accounts, right? Now, there are different names for this thing. You know, the Abominable Snowman that came about happened like between like 1950 and 1980 somewhere. Can't remember who it was. Somebody coined that term in an interesting, sensational article where explorers had gone into the mountains and found some tracks that they didn't know what they were. They assumed that they were wolves, and rather than call them wolf tracks, he created he went back into their culture a little bit more and realized that there was this other creature it could have been, and created this kind of sensational term, the abominable snowman. This thing has names like in Bhutan called Almas Migu or Migoi. In India, Megar, Latsin. We're talking about names in Tibet like Rime, which is forest dweller, Mi Shornpo, which is strong man, and Mi God, which is untamed man. So, and there's tons and tons of names. We won't get into all of them. The one that we know commonly is Yeti, which was from the Sherpa. They think that this is from the Tibetan Sherpa dialect, which is called a cliff dwelling bear or an animal from rocky places. And now, written accounts that we're aware of actually date back to the 12th century, where it was being called wild man, an ape-like being, and it was claimed that it did not have white fur, like everyone thinks, that this thing had reddish brown fur. And a lot of people don't know this, but even in those cultures, there are categories of Yeti. There are different sizes of Yeti. Some that are smaller, more than 4 feet tall. Some that are about 6.5 feet tall, some that are much larger, and the larger ones apparently run on all fours, like charging through the snow or whatever on all fours. And these are the massive Yeti that live on these mountains.
Yeah, people have described Bigfoot doing that.
Right. Why wouldn't he? I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean,
if you're going to get somewhere faster by using your arms, just do it.
I do that in the forest.
Right.
I mean,
Well, if you're on an incline too and you're running up a mountain, you're probably going to put both of your long arms as super
yeah,
muscular down and push yourself up forward a little bit
yeah,
more,
yeah.
launch yourself into the mountain. Um yeah, and so Yeti are claimed to live in alpine forests below the snow line, but occasionally wander up for food if they need it. Um, a lot of locals in the Tibetan and Nepali area they claim that you're more likely to hear a Yeti than to see one, and that the sound of these things is unmistakable. We're talking about like a high pitch scream that you'll hear, and then when one goes off, you'll hear a bunch of others answer in the mountains, which must be a little bit creepy, honestly, hearing that. Um, you've heard that scream before too, right?
I've heard it. I've heard the scream out in the forest, my local area. Not the Yeti, but
A Bigfoot or
Bigfoot.
something.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it. What I've heard is more of a whooping sound, almost like a gorilla monkey type thing,
Yes,
but it's exceedingly loud, like really, really effing loud.
really.
Yeah, and then I've also heard the what they call them knocking on wood. So you'll hear like knock, knock, knock in one location, and then in another location far away, you'll hear that as well. So
And
some
these
kind of
are communication.
communication, yeah, communication, because you can go out there where there are known sightings and start knocking, and eventually some may knock back. I mean, when it gets to that, who knows? Like, how many people are out? Like, it's all. What if it's just all Bigfoot researchers in the forest in my area, and they're just all like think they're talking to Bigfoot, but it's actually them. They're just talking
So
among themselves.
that sounds like a really interesting place of the US to live. Are there that many Bigfoot researchers in your area?
Yeah, yeah.
Really?
I mean, heck, like the county next door to me, Skamania County, they
Yeah.
there's a law where you can't shoot a Bigfoot.
Why would
So,
they create a law like that, you think?
right. Well, I mean, look,
Was it for
1959, the
fun?
state.
Was it like to bring tourism?
Is it
No,
a
really, I'm
joke?
asking.
Right.
Yeah,
I don't know. People say, obviously, people are going to say it's a joke.
right.
Obviously, people will say that, but the law still exists. But in 1959, the State Department put out I don't know what they call them, a notice to their people that are going to Tibet or the embassy in Tibet on how to deal with the Yeti. The State Department did. So, there are people in these positions of power who do take it seriously, who do know what it is. And my guess is that somebody's like, yeah, this is serious. We need to say something or make a law about it. And then they implement it. And then later on, everybody says it's just a joke because what else could it be but a joke? Because, hey, the
Well,
whole myth started with that Patterson Gimlin fake film.
and I mean, before you even mentioned the name Skamania, I've seen Skamania come up a bunch of times when I've looked into Bigfoot and Yeti and stuff,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Bigfoot. I mean, I'm say Bigfoot and Yeti because like you could kind of couple all of my research on Bigfoot into the Yeti from what I'm finding.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, it's the same creature, if not
Right.
cousins. It's like the Yowie, out of Australia.
Yeah.
The Yowie is a bit smaller, but the same, probably a genetic variant.
Well, and
Um,
those skunk apes that are in Florida are
yeah,
apparently like in the sixes too,
oh,
like between
those guys are
5 and
crazy. Those guys are crazy.
the
I
skunk
don't know what
apes?
it is. Like sometimes in different regions, like regionally, they have different people will have different experiences with them. So in some areas, like native tribes will consider them friendly. Um, and they live in clans and they interact with them a little bit. While in others, like the Bigfoot's like dragging their women away and eating their kids, right? Yeah. Oh, haven't you heard the stories? Like some of these stories are pretty intense. I mean, I'd like heard some stories about people
Well,
getting taken by Bigfoot to be their little sex slaves and stuff like that. Oh,
I'm sorry, that's too much.
yeah.
That's awful. So wait, are these some native stories? Like they have some records of this?
Oh yeah. Yeah. When you go back into when you dig and you find native stories on from different regions, they all have they all speak of the same being, but they're approached in different ways. Um, and it's like people's experiences too. Like one person may have an experience where they run into one of these that are aggressive. The next person may be like trading trinkets and gifts with the thing, right?
You know, I wonder if the Bigfoot in or big feet, whatever you want to call them, in Florida are influenced by the sheer amount of crackheads in Florida. Because maybe what it is like the crackheads there are just creating like this energetic field that the Bigfoots are influenced by, and then the skunk apes are going nuts out there and doing
Yeah,
weird things.
yeah, fentanyl Bigfoots, fentanyl swamp apes.
Right. And if you're from
Yeah,
Florida, you know what I'm talking about because you'll just see, you know who I'm talking about. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never heard that about skunk apes. But Florida really is very wild. I mean, we're talking about just the Everglades are just a crazy place. I mean, think about
right,
like just the different stuff that are there, the crocodiles, the alligators, just the weird, like you can't even go into that area. Like you're literally up half your legs or more in swamp. You can't get through it, and it's just
right,
crazy creatures live out there.
right, right. God, I heard one story. I don't know if it's true or not. We never viewed it of a skunk ape just destroying a police car. Police officer running away and just destroying the police car.
It just went off on it.
Yeah, it went off.
Must
It
have
was in
been
a
one of
neighborhood.
those skunk ape skunk ape teens with a lot of angst, you know?
Or just like
He's against
trying to
authority.
decompress from the meth or find more meth or I don't
Right.
know
Yeah, he
something.
got in he got into one of the crackheads' huts.
Yeah.
He snorted a bunch of meth or fentanyl, and then he was all it was it. That was it. It was over.
But I mean, there's like so here's the thing. It's like the UFO phenomena. Like there's so many reports of Yeti, like you found, like it's probably like you said is one of the most researched areas, like through time, through history. Whereas Bigfoot is more modern on the side of research. But when you take stories from across the world and take out the similarities, you can't help but notice, hey, there is something going on here, right? You
Yeah.
cannot deny that.
Oh,
And
yeah. I
and
mean,
to relegate it to a bear is the most absurd, intelligence insulting thing in the world.
well, there is a history to why they landed on a bear too, though. And I think it's important to bring that up because a lot
Because
of
bears
people
stand up and
no, it's
wave.
not just that's true if it's a nice bear. But the okay, if we look at kind of what happened, all right. Now, and for everybody who's watching and just watched that last segment where we were talking about skunk apes, we actually have a skunk ape expert that we interviewed on Rise.tv. Ben Chastain, who is my co-host on Edge of Wonder. He interviewed the skunk ape expert, and it was a really fascinating interview. So if you haven't watched that, John too, if you haven't watched that, I
I
highly
gotta watch
recommend
it.
it
Yeah.
because he's got
What I vote for is
yeah.
for Ben to go out there with him. That's what I
I,
vote for.
I've been telling him that, dude. After I watched that interview, I was like, you better get yourself out there,
Yeah.
man, because you're in the area already. Like, go research this stuff.
Yeah.
But he's got a lot of evidence too. I mean, he's run into him a bunch of times. It's pretty awesome. All right, so um, now I'm going to get into a little this history of how they landed on a bear. Okay, now we know that they were calling him like a man bear or a bear man, wild man, and all of that stuff, right? There's different reports of these things. There's even different categories. So people are seeing different things, and then they're calling all of these things yetis. So it's important to also mention that, okay? But there is a two-legged animal that is called the mete, which is close to Yeti. It's very close, and it appears in Buddhist temples and religious painted scrolls. And the mete, which means bear man, right? That's what this thing is. Now, there are religious texts like this one called the Mani Kabum. I might have mispronounced that. Mani Kabum. It describes these wild humans as existing in the realm of rebirth between the realm of humans and animals.
Hmm.
And Tibetans also acknowledge that. Now, you got to listen to this, John. This is really interesting. There is this story about the creation myth of the Mani Kabum, oh sorry, in the Mani Kabum of the Yeti. All right. Now, what it says is basically that according to the Mani Kabum, that's that text that I just told you about, Tibet was once a giant lake that receded and it left behind a bunch of forests, animals, and mountains, which is weird when we start talking about all of the flood history stories that we have of Noah's flood and that happening cyclically, like every 15,000 years or something like that. This is very interesting. I found this out is that in some areas, in some local areas, it's really weird because this is like brings a lot of other research that I've done into this without even like expecting it to. In some of these areas throughout Nepal and Tibet, they believe that mountains are actually gods in mountainous form, that they appear as mountains, but they're actually gods. And that the Yetis are the transition between the mountain and the human beings that actually make sure that the humans in that local area around that mountain are good. And
Huh.
so they actually lay the smackdown on the local area when the morality is going off or people are doing bad things. So in some local areas, if people see a Yeti, this is the old man of the mountain in New Hampshire we're looking at right now, which fell off, by the way, unfortunately, a few years ago. But just to kind of show you that mountains often take on these strange characteristics of human beings or other things. But anyway, point is, if people would see a Yeti out in the wild, they would immediately go into prayer because they would think that they had done something wrong and that the Yeti was there to dole out, you know, kind of like a a lashing or two from the immortal or the god that protected that area.
Right. Right. Oh, that's interesting. That's very different um, than how native peoples in the United States relate the Bigfoot. They're the Bigfoot from their perspective is usually well, it has a paranormal aspect, but mostly flesh and blood type of being. But then also in the native cultures, they do talk about a paranormal type aspect from Bigfoot. And you know what? I've not found any stories about the Yeti itself on the paranormal side, but I don't know, maybe you did, other than
You,
that one that
you
you just relayed.
well, I mean, all of these almost as a thread throughout all of these cultures, they all claim that this is a supernatural being that lives between like that basically lives half in the realm of rebirth.
Well, I mean I mean, look, I mean when you get to Bigfoot, like some of the stories around Bigfoot would go in that direction because native cultures have said that Bigfoot's able to go into another world and back. And in fact, like for most people, I guess Bigfoot is very difficult for them to consider being real, obviously because of what's propagated throughout mainstream. Um, but then when you add that whole paranormal side on top of it, it's like they don't even want to touch it. And that's why there's a lot of researchers out there who just like focus on the flesh and blood aspect and negate anything that's paranormal about it or push it off and not include it in the reports. But when you go through data over the Bigfoot, for instance, which is related to the Yeti, same general creature, there are all these really interesting congruences within experiences that people have on the paranormal side with this being, in that the way that it seems to disappear and the appearance of orbs around, in fact, I've seen these orbs before, will just be there one moment and gone the next, which that's like your story that you just told.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, right. Other people have seen these orbs around Bigfoots, and they see orbs in all kinds of different weird situations. And um, I don't know why it is. Like, we've talked about this before, but it's like when there's one weird paranormal thing going on, you'll often find other weird paranormal things going on at the same time, as if like aliens or UFOs are attracted to a strange energetic difference in a certain area that's coming about, and you just find the same phenomena all in one area. I think that's probably why your area in
Yeah.
Washington is so weird. Is like that area just has a lot of weird paranormal stuff going on all the time.
Oh yeah. I remember once I was, this wasn't that long ago, watching, there was a stand of trees, pine trees. It was probably a couple hundred yards away, and it was night, dark, and I and some other people were watching this red orb, probably like 20 feet up, like just kind of like bobbing around in a certain area. I'm like looking at it. I'm going, looking with night vision and looking with, we're all just like, what is that thing? It's like, there's nothing out there. It's just this red ball just bobbing around, and then moved off and disappeared, and probably watched it for about 10 minutes or so. And so when I had tasked on that, like what was that remote viewing, it referred back to a consciousness that that like extended itself into sort of a plasma type energy, which
Right.
is an orb, in order to perceive things from a different perspective. And the consciousness that projected itself seemed to be a Bigfoot in the data. So
That's
that,
super. Yeah, that's super normal stuff.
right, super normal. And so there is where you get into the whole paranormal side of the Bigfoot, of the Yeti, and the really the most researchers dispense with that stuff, because it's not going to help the case of getting the general public to believe it's something real once they start including the paranormal side. But in what I've seen with this being, there is a massively interesting and weird paranormal side to it, not just in reports, but what we've seen with our data. And like going back to that story again that you just told, of it living between the worlds in the realm of rebirth and here, well, that's really fascinating. Really fascinating. Because that does line up. That lines up with stuff that I've remote viewed around it, stuff that native peoples have talked about with it. So yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's maybe why people see it so infrequently up there. It's not like you see these things all the time. We're talking about. I mean, look, we're talking about in. We have this monk who we were just talking about, the Lama Sangwa Dorje. I may have mispronounced that. That's the guy that walked from India to Nepal, right? He actually took one of these scalps with him, allegedly, when the Yeti died. This that was helping him. In order to prove it, he took the scalp with him and put it in the temple as a holy relic. Also, a Yeti hand was included with that, and at that same temple, which is called Pangboche Gompa, the monastery was founded around year 1667 by Sangwa Dorje. They had this hand added to the collection. Now, in 1959, there was an explorer named Peter Byrne who went there to this temple, and he stole a few of the finger bones from the hand and replaced them with human fingers. Now, this is why the monks would never show these relics to anyone, because they were like really important to the internal monastery. But they let this one guy in, and he steals a few of the finger bones. Later on, they they start doing tests the on these fingers, and they find them to be human bones. So we don't know now if this thing was actually a Yeti like bone, or if this was
Right.
human. I mean, we will never know. And the scalp was later found to be a hoax, but we don't know about that either. And I can, in a way, we'll never know about this either because the tests that were done on the scalp were done between 1961 and 1962 sometime in thereabouts. And the problem is that in 1959 or 1960, um there were, the expeditions basically had to stop going to Tibet because the Chinese Communist Party basically was cracking down on the Tibetans. There was, like, a bunch of unrest in Tibet because of the Chinese authorities, or the Chinese communist authorities there. And then they started suppressing um, the Tibetans, and they believed that anyone coming into Tibet to do expeditions or anything like that could be spies. So they just cracked down on all of that. But somehow, mysteriously, this one guy in the 1960s is allowed in, right? And he does these tests on I think his name was I think it was Edmund Hillary and Marlon Perkins. They went with a team of scientists. They did tests on the hand and the scalp and debunked them. Okay. Now, again, they said that the fur was like this like type of goat that they have there, that the fur was from this type of goat. But the reason why this is so weird to me is because I almost think that the only way that the CCP would allow those guys to come in and do any of this in the first place was was if they were going to debunk it,
Right.
because they don't like any culture that would support the supernatural or anything being out of this world. The Communist Party sought to suppress back then because they were trying heavily to destroy the culture and control the people. So
Right.
we've still got a strange we've a lot of people then after this happened just started saying, well, they're mistaking all of these for bears. That's
Right.
how it happened.
Right.
Is the
Right.
debunking of those two relics basically caused everyone to just stop going there for expeditions and then think that these were all bears that people were seeing.
Right. Exactly. And then get bear hair, do genetic testing, and that's that. I think they related it to a 18,000-year-old extinct polar bear that
Yes,
like some
there
kind of
were.
genetic variation off of it now or something in the mountains there.
Yeah. So what John is talking about, for those of you at home, is a little bit after the scalp and the hands were quote unquote debunked. Some other people found some hair out in the wilderness, or the Himalayan wilderness, the very cold wilderness, and they brought it in. Some researchers did tests on it, and it was found to be this extinct version of a polar bear or something like that.
Right. Yeah,
How would
that's
they know?
that's the unfortunate thing, and then it all gets classified under that, and research is all shut down for the most part.
Okay, so the real question is then, after watching a bunch of stuff on the Yeti, most of the mainstream stories will go through how all of these explorers went there to look, all of these mentions, how all of these different, like, we're talking about different explorers being on the mountain and together seeing something that they didn't understand and then reporting it in different books. And yet we're still at a place where this thing is debunked, that it doesn't exist. Mainstream media will tell us that it doesn't. But John, what did you and your remote viewers find?
Oh, I mean, it's just like Bigfoot. I mean, when we look, okay, so here's a for instance. I mean, there's so much like skullduggery, or I don't know what do you want to call it, around this stuff. Like for instance, there's a video that showed up years ago of a white yeti in the Spanish mountains near a ski resort, right? And so everybody grabbed that, started throwing it all around. I mean, because it's fairly clear video, and I remember remote viewing that just to see what was what on it, and we got a person in a suit. We got a hoax on it, and
Mm,
and then later on it was admitted to as being a hoax by the ski resort. So you know there is a lot of hoaxing around this, especially around footprints.
Hmm.
There are certain things that you can tell about it. And so, about like if it's a real thing or not with footprints, I don't know how easy that is with snow in general.
Well, have
But
you ever seen that Eric Shipton footprint, the like most famous footprint of the Yeti?
yeah,
It's called the Shipton print.
right, exactly.
Was that real or a hoax?
That's real.
Real.
That's real because when we view that, we get it's the same with all this stuff, and it actually gets kind of boring to remote view. It's typically what remote viewers go to is this sort of like sense of power, like in the being, like they always describe it being very big. They describe it as a subject, an intelligent subject, not a bear, but as an intelligent subject that is typically, looking for food, scavenging, hunting, and is very powerful. Like extremely powerful.
Wow.
That's like the data always goes down that path, and so like this shows up the same in a lot of instances of whether they caught it on film and we remote view it, or there's a footprint and we remote view it, always describes the same type of subject. And this Yeti is the same type of subject as the Bigfoot. There's really no difference in it except for probably some minor genetic variations
Mm.
across continents. And it, like the creature is like typically foraging, looking for food. Like that's pretty much what it's doing all the time. Even like going around places where humans are living and digging around in those locations quite frequently, actually, because humans just dump a lot of stuff that they go after. But then there's this whole other aspect, this whole other side where there's a sort of a community cultural type thing that they have, where they basically have family units and sort of clan type
Mm.
units that they live in, much like what the Native Americans speak about here in the United States. So none of the data from me and from other viewers ever describes it as being an animal. It's always a man like subject, but it's
Wow.
very large, very hairy, very powerful. It's got no inherent darkness, anger, evilness, or anything like that. It's a subject that is living like in this realm. Now, as a normal thing with the Bigfoot or the Yeti, we don't get it being paranormal to any degree unless we take somebody's sighting where a Bigfoot did a paranormal thing. Like generally, like when we see a video or we see footprints and we remote view it, it never goes into a paranormal aspect of Bigfoot. Like so this thing is like a flesh and blood more so
Right.
type of being. But then it's like, see, I don't know how deep these two sides go with each other when it comes to these creatures. The traversing world thing versus the physical thing. I don't know how those things intermingle, right? I don't know if it's the same for all Bigfoot. I don't know if it's small segment or some offshoot of them, but it's like when we take those stories where somebody has had what they think is a paranormal experience with a Bigfoot, it definitely goes into it. It absolutely goes into it where they can exist in a different world than here. They can utilize the plasma of what orbs are. Like orbs are when people photograph orbs and they say they're orbs and they're not bugs and all that stuff. We've remote viewed those and it's a plasma type earth energy that's created. And in that plasma type earth energy, consciousness can utilize it, can go into it, can project into it. I mean, humans can even do this and then use it as sort of an extension of itself. And so we see a lot of that. Like they can use that. So they have some type of ability. Yeah.
Wow. And um so there is some supernormal aspect to these things, and they definitely do exist. I mean, we're not talking about people that are mistaking a bear for these things.
No,
And have
no.
you
I mean, it's like our data never goes in that direction ever. And we've remote viewed many animals, bears. We remote view animals all the time in training and practice and stuff like that. So no, never describes anything close to a bear ever,
and
ever.
have you ever encountered, or just asking you this, like or remote viewed this Yeti that's larger that runs on all fours instead? I mean, are there different categories of these things?
Well, they will run on all fours and also stand up.
So they're doing
and
both.
and go bipedal. Yeah, because sometimes they'll just do that. In fact, there are plenty of reports out there where people have seen Bigfoot go on all fours and then go up bipedal. It's not a bear. I mean, it's very easy to tell the difference between a bear
Yeah.
and this because the bear's legs are like this big compared to a
Yeah.
Bigfoot. I mean, it's a different thing. It's a totally different thing. So yeah, a big difference. And yeah, they'll run on all fours. Yeah, like the dog man too. The dog man stories where it'll go on all fours and also go bipedal. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The dog man is a big rabbit hole we'll have to
Yeah.
get into at some point. um, well, so you guys, if you're looking for more information about the Yeti and what we're talking about, John has a killer episode on rise.tv
Oh jeez, the
about
Dyatlov Pass.
okay, so
We
let's
didn't even
not
talk
get
about that one.
no, we didn't, and I think we may go into the Dyatlov Pass at some point here, but what I would recommend is for those of you at home that want more information about this, go over to rise.tv, do yourself a favor,
Exactly.
and watch John's episode on Chronicles of a Psychic Spy about the Dyatlov Pass. And yeah, if you don't crap your pants after that, I'm serious. Like for real, that is a great. I mean, it's a mystery. The Dyatlov Pass, anyway, is a gigantic mystery that no one's been able to solve. And John and his team went in and gave some um,
It's
information about
compelling.
exactly. Yeah, it's very compelling
Yeah.
information. It is. All right. Well, this has been really interesting. I had no idea there was such a long history to the Yeti. I thought this was a thing that was just, cousin of the Bigfoot, all kind of came about sort of like CNN's been telling us, like after this video was taken back in the day of Bigfoot. But no, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years here, maybe even thousands of years where people have been seeing this. And so pretty exciting stuff. John, did you have anything else to add?
No, I mean, I think that one of the big things people can do when they go to the forest is look at deadfall patterns and try to understand deadfall patterns in the forest. In other words, like how branches fall in the forest, and to become very very aware of that stuff, because you will begin to find indications that not all deadfall is deadfall. That's all I'm going to say. Just be very aware of that. Yeah, because that'll lead you to these types of subjects.
Yeah, we're talking
Beings.
about communications like these whoops that you were talking about, like the whoop whoop in the forest, the screams that we heard or that they were talking about in Tibet and Nepal with the Yeti, and then another form of communication potentially being strange patterns that are being made with branches and stuff.
Yeah.
And when you see those, there may just be a Yeti or a Bigfoot around,
Yep.
especially if you're in a forest.
Yep.
All right. Well, John, thanks so much for being with us. All of you at home, please leave your comments below. We would love to hear from you guys, especially if you have your own story or your own encounter with these things or information that we didn't yet cover in these episodes. It's impossible for us to cover everything in one of these episodes. So definitely leave a comment below. Let us know what you think. I'd love to see any information you got there. And yeah, we hope you guys thought this episode was as out of this world as we did. We'll see you next time.